I hope in the years to come, everyone will be able to take pride in how they responded to this challenge.
When people think of the British royal family, the headlines tend to circle around the same figures. King Charles III, who is now tasked with guiding the monarchy into a new era. Prince William and Catherine, often praised for their public appearances and their role as the modern face of royalty. And, of course, Prince Harry and Meghan, whose move away from the United Kingdom has kept them at the center of ongoing debate. These stories dominate the press, and with them comes a constant cycle of commentary, analysis, and at times, controversy. Yet there is another member of the family whose story is far less known, but arguably just as important.
Their Majesties' greetings on this day. They send you their very best wishes.
That is Prince Edward, the youngest son of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip. Unlike his siblings, Edward has largely stayed out of the front pages. He is rarely the subject of sensational headlines, and his personal life has never been tabloid fuel in the same way others have experienced. For some, this has made him easy to overlook, but when you look closely at his journey, it becomes clear that he has played a distinctive role in the monarchy, one defined by quiet determination and subtle but meaningful choices. His story begins in 1964, a time when the United Kingdom was undergoing a cultural shift. It was the year the Beatles were dominating the charts, Harold Wilson had become Prime Minister, and discussions about gender roles and social conventions were increasingly visible in public life. Against this backdrop, Edward's birth on March 10th was itself part of a quiet revolution inside the palace. Queen Elizabeth II had already given birth to 3 children, Charles in 1948, Anne in 1950, and Andrew in 1960. In all of those instances, she had followed strict royal protocol, which meant that Prince Philip was not present in the delivery room. For the royal household, childbirth was traditionally a private matter involving the mother, doctors, and attendants, but not the father. However, by the early 1960s, cultural attitudes were changing. Women's magazines were publishing articles encouraging fathers to play a bigger role during childbirth. The Queen, then 37 years old and aware of the shifting mood, decided to break with tradition. When Edward was born, Philip was present in the delivery room. To modern audiences, that might seem like an ordinary decision. Today, it is common for fathers to be there during the birth of their children. But in the early 1960s, this was remarkable. For a monarch known for her sense of duty and her careful observance of tradition, it was a bold choice that spoke volumes about her willingness to adapt. Historians have pointed out that this was not just a personal decision, but also a symbolic one. It reflected how even the most traditional institutions could evolve, albeit in small steps. Edward's early years reflected this balance between tradition and a gradual opening to the world beyond palace walls. As the youngest child in the family, he grew up in a slightly different environment from his siblings. Charles, Anne, and Andrew were born when the Queen was younger, and the demands of establishing her reign were greater. By the time Edward arrived, she was more settled in her role as monarch, and there was a noticeable shift in how she approached family life. From an early age, Edward showed interests that set him apart. One of the most memorable moments from his childhood came when he was just 5 years old. During a royal event, he met Neil Armstrong, the first man to walk on the moon. For a young boy, this was an extraordinary encounter. The late 1960s were a period of fascination with space exploration, and the Apollo 11 mission was one of the defining moments of the century. Meeting Armstrong left a lasting impression on Edward, sparking a lifelong interest in stories and experiences that went beyond the traditional royal framework. While his siblings were more closely aligned with established royal duties, Edward seemed drawn to areas where imagination, creativity, and a sense of wonder played a bigger role. Education was an important part of his upbringing, as it was for all the royal children. Like his father and his brothers before him, Edward was sent to Gordonstoun School in Scotland. The school was well known for its rigorous physical training, outdoor activities, and emphasis on discipline. Prince Philip had thrived there, praising it as a place that built resilience and character. But Charles, Edward's eldest brother, famously disliked his time there, once describing it as more like a prison than a school. Edward's experience, however, was quite different. He adapted well to the environment, developed leadership qualities, and eventually became head boy. More importantly, it was at Gordonstoun that he discovered his passion for theater. The school's emphasis on extracurricular activities gave him the chance to take part in plays and productions. This discovery would become a central theme in his life, shaping both his career decisions and his sense of identity. Unlike the traditional royal path of military service or immediate dedication to official duties, Edward began to cultivate an interest in the arts. This difference in outlook didn't mean he rejected his royal responsibilities, but it did suggest a willingness to follow a more individual path. It is also worth noting that by the time Edward was a teenager, the royal family had already been adapting to a new era of visibility. Television broadcasts of royal events, such as the coronation of Elizabeth II in 1953 and later royal weddings, had brought the monarchy closer to the public than ever before. In this new context, Edward's interest in performance and production wasn't entirely out of place. It reflected a world in which storytelling, media, and public presentation were becoming more powerful tools of influence. Looking back at these formative years, it is striking how Edward's life was shaped by small but meaningful departures from tradition. His birth marked a shift in royal protocol. His schooling revealed a different perspective on the Gordonstoun experience, and his encounter with Neil Armstrong gave him an early sense of fascination with achievements outside the royal bubble. These moments set him on a course that would diverge from those of his siblings, and they help explain why his story has remained unique within the royal family. In many ways, this first chapter of his life can be seen as a quiet foundation for what came later. Edward was not destined to be king, nor was he expected to take on the kind of high-profile public roles that his elder siblings did. But within the royal family, even those not directly in line to the throne are shaped by public expectations and family traditions. What makes Edward's journey notable is that he found ways to respect those traditions, while also exploring interests that belonged uniquely to him. This balance between duty and personal choice, between history and modernity, would go on to define much of his adult life. As Prince Edward moved beyond his school years, it became clear that his life would not follow the same straight line of tradition that had defined much of the royal family's expectations. Many of his relatives had followed predictable paths, rooted in the military or in highly visible roles within the monarchy. Edward, however, began making choices that surprised not only the public, but also his own family. These choices did not signal rebellion in the dramatic sense, but they did reflect a desire to carve out a life on his own terms. After finishing at Gordonstoun, Edward took a step that few could have anticipated. Instead of immediately joining the military or stepping directly into royal duties, he traveled to New Zealand. This was not a royal tour, carefully arranged and full of formal appearances. Instead, he lived and worked at Wanganui Collegiate School, a well-regarded institution in the city of Wanganui on the country's North Island. There, he worked as a junior master and theater director. For 6 months, Edward was immersed in a world far from the rigid structures of royal life. He taught students, directed school productions, and lived in a way that was both ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. What made this experience so significant was the way it broadened his perspective. New Zealand, though part of the Commonwealth, offered Edward an environment where he was less of a prince and more of a teacher. For someone raised in the confines of the palace, this exposure was invaluable. Those who knew him at the time have described him as approachable, invested in his work, and genuinely interested in the students. For Edward, it was a chance to connect with people on a level that had nothing to do with his title, but the royal family had its own expectations. For centuries, service in the military had been a tradition among male royals. His father, Prince Philip, had served with distinction in the Royal Navy during the Second World War. His elder brother Charles had trained with the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force. For Edward, the chosen branch was the Royal Marines, one of the most respected and physically demanding forces in Britain. He began his training with the expectation that this would be his career path. The Royal Marines had a reputation for toughness, discipline, and high standards. But only 4 months into his training, Edward made a decision that shocked not only his family, but also the public. He resigned. The announcement created headlines across Britain, many of them critical. For a prince to step away from such a long-standing tradition seemed almost unthinkable. Reports at the time suggested that the training had been especially grueling, and that Edward struggled with its physical demands. Others pointed out that his heart simply wasn't in it. While Charles had once described Gordonstoun as harsh but endurable, Edward had thrived in that environment, and so the idea of quitting military training wasn't immediately consistent with his earlier character. Yet the reality was that Edward's interests and passions had always pointed elsewhere. Unlike his siblings, he had shown a strong inclination for creative and artistic pursuits. For him, the Royal Marines may have felt more like a duty than a calling. For Prince Philip, this was particularly difficult. A man who placed immense value on discipline, service, and resilience, Philip reportedly viewed Edward's resignation as a disappointment. The contrast between father and son was stark. One had built his entire adult life around military service, while the other chose to leave it behind. But Edward was not turning away from responsibility altogether. Instead, he was moving toward a different kind of career, one that would place him in an industry few royals had ever explored: entertainment. Edward's next steps reflected his passion for theater and storytelling. He began working with Andrew Lloyd Webber, one of the most influential figures in British musical theater. At Webber's Really Useful Theatre Company, Edward did not hold a ceremonial role or a position of honorary status. Instead, he worked as a production assistant, learning the business side of theater from the ground up. This willingness to take on an ordinary role in a very public industry was unusual for a member of the royal family, who typically operated within insulated circles of privilege. By the late 1980s, Edward had also ventured into television. In 1987, he was behind the production of a reality-style television show called It's a Royal Knockout. The program featured members of the royal family competing in games for charity. Although the intentions behind the show were positive, it aimed to raise money and present the royals in a more approachable light, the reception was far from flattering. Critics called it undignified and ridiculed the spectacle of royals in costumes taking part in physical challenges. The press reviews were harsh, and it became a cautionary tale about how modernizing the monarchy through entertainment could backfire. For Edward, however, the criticism did not seem to crush his interest in the field. In 1993, he founded his own production company, Ardent Productions. This was a bold move. Rather than simply lending his name or serving as a figurehead, Edward stepped into the role of producer, taking responsibility for the direction and output of the company. What made this venture especially noteworthy was Edward's decision to distance himself from his royal identity. He often went by Edward Windsor in professional settings, signaling his desire to be judged on merit rather than title. Ardent Productions specialized in documentaries, including one that explored the life of Edward VIII, the king who had abdicated the throne in 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson. The documentary, titled Edward on Edward, drew attention for its subject matter, but the company itself struggled financially. Despite Edward's determination, Ardent never managed to achieve the kind of commercial success its founder had hoped for. Critics accused him of exploiting his royal connections to gain access to projects, while others argued he was overly ambitious without the necessary experience. Over the course of 9 years, Edward kept the company running, facing repeated setbacks and mounting criticism. Eventually, it became clear that Ardent was not sustainable. The financial difficulties, combined with the pressures of his royal duties, led him to wind down the business. For some, this period was evidence that royals could not successfully operate in the private sector. For Edward, however, it showed a different quality: resilience. He had taken a risk, invested time and energy into an industry that fascinated him, and carried on despite the obstacles. Looking back at this period of Edward's life, it is easy to see why it stood out so much from the rest of the royal family's trajectory. Teaching in New Zealand, resigning from the Royal Marines, producing theater and television, and attempting to run a company. All of these steps pointed to someone searching for a balance between personal passion and public expectation. While the headlines at the time were often unkind, the larger story is one of a man who dared to step outside of a narrow definition of royal duty. In many ways, this stage of Edward's life also mirrored broader cultural shifts. The 1980s and 1990s were decades in which media and entertainment gained immense power in shaping public opinion. Royals were increasingly scrutinized not just for their formal duties, but also for how they presented themselves to the public. Edward's interest in media can be seen as a reflection of that environment, even if his particular attempts were not always successful. What is often overlooked, though, is the determination he showed throughout. Where some might have retreated after public criticism, Edward continued trying. He stayed committed to his projects, even when they did not deliver the results he had hoped for. This persistence, though it did not bring fame or financial success, revealed a side of Edward that was consistent with his personality. He was not afraid to follow his own path, even if it was unconventional. As Edward's professional experiments in theater, television, and film played out with mixed results, his personal life began to take shape in ways that would prove far more stable and rewarding. For a man who had often been portrayed as struggling to define his role in the world, his eventual marriage to Sophie Rhys-Jones marked a turning point, both privately and in his public image. Together, Edward and Sophie would become one of the most consistent and respected partnerships in the royal family, known not for drama or controversy, but for steady commitment. Edward first met Sophie in 1993 at a charity tennis event. At the time, Sophie was working as a public relations professional, co-owning her own PR agency. She had built her career outside the royal bubble and was known as independent, capable, and ambitious. Their early interactions did not immediately grab headlines, but their relationship slowly grew. Unlike the high-profile romances of Edward's siblings, which often played out in front of a hungry press, Edward and Sophie managed to keep their courtship relatively private. This sense of privacy was crucial for both of them. The 1980s and 1990s had been turbulent decades for the monarchy. Prince Charles and Princess Diana's marriage had collapsed in a very public and painful way. Prince Andrew's marriage to Sarah Ferguson had also ended in separation and scandal. In contrast, Edward and Sophie's relationship developed in an atmosphere of discretion. By the time they announced their engagement in January 1999, it was clear to observers that their bond was genuine and built on mutual respect. The wedding took place later that year, on June 19th, at St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. While royal weddings are often grand occasions watched by millions, Edward and Sophie opted for a ceremony that was more modest than those of his siblings. Around 200 million people tuned in worldwide, but the event itself was striking in its relative simplicity. There was no state banquet, no military procession, and no towering display of royal pageantry. Guests were asked not to wear hats, a break from tradition, and the couple appeared intent on making the day as personal as possible. The Queen played an important role in supporting this union. She gifted Sophie a tiara from her own personal collection for the wedding day, a gesture that carried deep symbolic meaning. Beyond material gifts, the Queen seemed to embrace Sophie wholeheartedly, and over time Sophie became known for her unusually close relationship with her mother-in-law. Some royal correspondents describe Sophie as like a second daughter to the Queen, highlighting the warmth of their connection. The marriage itself quickly stood out for its stability. While Edward had pursued paths outside royal tradition, his relationship with Sophie reflected a grounded and pragmatic approach to life. Together, they built a home environment that balanced the demands of public duty with private family life. In the years following their wedding, they welcomed 2 children, Lady Louise Windsor in 2003 and James, Viscount Severn, in 2007. Unlike William and Harry, who grew up with intense media scrutiny, Louise and James were raised with a greater degree of privacy. Edward and Sophie made deliberate efforts to shield their children from constant attention, ensuring they could enjoy a childhood more in line with their peers. But marriage and family life did not mean Edward could simply step away from the pressures of public duty. At the time of their wedding, both Edward and Sophie were still pursuing careers outside the monarchy. Edward was running Ardent Productions, while Sophie was continuing her PR work. This dual approach, maintaining professional careers while also fulfilling royal responsibilities, was unusual and not without its complications. By the early 2000s, however, the royal family was under significant strain. The deaths of Princess Diana in 1997 and Princess Margaret and the Queen Mother in 2002 had placed emotional and symbolic burdens on the institution. Public trust had been shaken, and there was an urgent need to restore a sense of stability. Against this backdrop, Edward and Sophie made a pivotal decision. In 2002, they announced that they would give up their private careers and dedicate themselves full-time to royal duties. This was not an easy choice. Both had invested years into building their careers, and stepping away from them meant setting aside ambitions outside the royal framework. Yet it also reflected a deep sense of duty. The monarchy needed reliable figures who could take on engagements, support charities, and represent the institution without scandal. Edward and Sophie became exactly that. The Queen supported them in this transition, offering financial compensation for their lost careers and entrusting them with significant responsibilities. Edward, in particular, took on many of his father's commitments, especially in connection with the Duke of Edinburgh's award. This youth program, founded by Prince Philip in 1956, aimed to challenge young people to develop skills, physical fitness, and community service. Edward had long admired the initiative and became deeply involved in expanding its reach both in the UK and internationally. An interesting detail from this period is Edward's title. At his wedding, instead of receiving the traditional dukedom given to the monarch's sons, he was made Earl of Wessex. The choice was surprising at the time. Reports later revealed that Edward himself had expressed an interest in the title, inspired by the film Shakespeare in Love, which featured a character known as the Earl of Wessex. The title, rooted in early English history but revived in a modern cultural context, perfectly captured Edward's ability to blend tradition with a personal touch. Sophie's role in this new chapter was equally important. She quickly became one of the most popular members of the royal family, admired for her down-to-earth nature, strong work ethic, and ability to connect with people across different backgrounds. She built close relationships not only within the royal family, but also with the public, often described as approachable and warm. Her bond with the Queen grew stronger over the years, and her presence alongside Edward helped to solidify their image as a dependable team. Together, Edward and Sophie created a model of royal service that was less about glamour and more about consistency. They did not attract constant tabloid coverage, but their steady approach to duty proved invaluable. They became known for supporting over 70 charities, focusing on youth programs, disability organizations, and cultural institutions. While others in the family made headlines for controversies, Edward and Sophie built a reputation for professionalism. What makes this period particularly notable is how it demonstrated Edward's ability to adapt. After the challenges of his earlier ventures in show business and the scrutiny he faced for leaving the Royal Marines, his marriage and subsequent career choices marked a turning point. He had found a way to balance his individuality with the responsibilities of his role. In Sophie, he had a partner who not only understood the pressures of public life, but also shared his commitment to service. The decision to embrace full-time royal duties came at a time when the monarchy needed figures who could restore faith in the institution. Edward and Sophie's stability contrasted sharply with the turbulence of other royal marriages. In many ways, they became the quiet backbone of the family, taking on engagements without fuss and earning respect through consistency. The later years of Prince Edward's life have been defined by both deep personal loss and a growing sense of purpose. After decades of searching for his place, experimenting with careers, and quietly building a strong family life, Edward entered the 2020s as a figure whose role within the monarchy had become clear. His journey was never one of headlines or constant public attention, but his steady presence has allowed him to emerge as one of the most trusted and respected members of the royal family. The most significant moments of this period were without doubt, the deaths of his parents. Prince Philip died in April 2021 at the age of 99. For Edward, the loss was particularly profound. He had shared a close relationship with his father, one rooted not just in duty, but also in shared values. Unlike Charles, who often had a complicated relationship with Philip, Edward seemed to understand him in a unique way. Observers noted that Philip saw in Edward a son who shared his practical outlook, his sense of duty, and his appreciation for straightforwardness. In Edward's study, a portrait of his father held a prominent place, symbolizing this deep bond. When Philip passed, Edward gave rare public statements about the loss, speaking openly about the emotional impact it had on him. For a royal, this kind of candor was striking. He described the experience as shocking and difficult, echoing the feelings of countless people who have lost loved ones. His words reminded many that even within the royal family, grief is a deeply human experience. Unlike the formal and reserved image that had often defined Philip's generation, Edward's willingness to express vulnerability made him relatable to the public in a new way. The loss of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, the following year in September 2022, added to the weight of personal grief. Elizabeth had been a constant in Edward's life for nearly 6 decades, not just as his mother, but as the guiding figure of the monarchy. Her death marked the end of an era for Britain and the Commonwealth. But for Edward, it was also the loss of a parent who had always supported him. The Queen had played a particularly important role in welcoming Sophie into the family, and her trust in Edward and Sophie had been a source of strength. With her passing, Edward stepped further into a role that required him to carry forward her legacy in his own way. At the same time, the monarchy itself was undergoing change. With Charles as king, the institution faced the challenge of redefining its role in modern society. Public expectations had shifted dramatically since Edward was born in 1964. The monarchy was now scrutinized in ways unimaginable in the past, with social media amplifying both praise and criticism. Against this backdrop, Edward and Sophie's reputation for reliability became one of the monarchy's quiet strengths. Together, the couple took on a wide range of charitable responsibilities. They supported more than 70 organizations, focusing on issues such as youth development, disability rights, culture, and education. Much of Edward's work remained connected to his father's legacy through the Duke of Edinburgh's award. He played a central role in ensuring that the program continued to inspire and support young people worldwide, keeping alive the vision that Philip had championed for decades. For Edward, this was more than just carrying on a duty. It was a way of honoring his father's values while making them relevant to new generations. Sophie's contributions were equally significant. She continued to strengthen her reputation as one of the most approachable and hardworking members of the family. Many observers noted that her ability to connect with people from all walks of life helped soften the royal image and bring a sense of warmth to their engagements. Together, Edward and Sophie presented a model of royal service that was not dramatic or headline-grabbing, but consistent and effective. Their stability stood out in a family that had often been marked by turbulence. While other royals were making headlines for controversies, disagreements, or high-profile personal decisions, Edward and Sophie quietly went about their duties. This contrast did not go unnoticed. Many commentators began to describe them as the safe pair of hands within the monarchy, a couple who could always be relied upon to fulfill their commitments without distraction. Edward's story also demonstrated something broader about the modern monarchy, that service does not always have to come with spectacle. For decades, the public had often been drawn to the drama of royal life, the grand weddings, the divorces, the feuds, and the scandals. But Edward showed that influence could also be built through quiet consistency. By avoiding unnecessary drama and focusing on long-term commitments, he carved out a niche that made him indispensable to the institution. Another element of his later life that gained attention was his approach to authenticity. Edward's earlier years had been full of attempts to strike out on his own, whether through teaching in New Zealand, working in theater, or starting a production company. Many of those ventures had not produced lasting success, but they had given him something valuable: experience. in following his own instincts. That sense of independence never entirely left him. Even as he settled into his role as a full-time working royal, Edward carried with him an understanding of life beyond the palace walls. This authenticity made him relatable. When he spoke about grief, or when he took part in engagements without fanfare, it was clear that he was not simply acting out a script. His life had been shaped by choices, mistakes, lessons, and perseverance. That made his later service feel grounded in reality, rather than just tradition. As Charles's reign developed, Edward's role became even more important. The king has spoken of wanting a slimmed-down monarchy, one where fewer members of the family take on official duties. In this context, the reliability of Edward and Sophie carried weight. They represented the kind of modern royals who could maintain the dignity of the institution while also adapting to new expectations. The public perception of Edward shifted significantly during this period. Once described as uncertain or overshadowed by his siblings, he came to be seen as an example of quiet success. His story suggested that impact does not always come from being in the spotlight. Sometimes it comes from the persistence of showing up, day after day, in service of others. The lessons of Edward's life carry relevance beyond the monarchy itself. In a world that often equates success with visibility, Edward demonstrated that consistency and authenticity can be just as powerful. His path was not one of dramatic gestures, but of steady conviction. This message resonated especially at a time when institutions like the monarchy face questions about their place in society. Edward's story also underscored the possibility of balancing tradition with personal authenticity. He never abandoned his role as a royal, but he also never entirely abandoned himself. His interests in theater, storytelling, and creativity were part of who he was, even if they did not always bring him the success he hoped for. What mattered more was that he tried, and that he remained true to those parts of himself. As Britain looks to the future, the monarchy continues to evolve. Its survival depends not only on its ability to adapt to social change, but also on the individuals within it. In Edward, the institution has an example of how adaptation can happen without losing a sense of duty. His life has shown that you can be traditional without being rigid, royal without being aloof, and dutiful without being detached. For a man often called the quiet royal, Edward's story offers more lessons than many of the louder headlines. He has shown that dignity can come from modesty, that influence can be built on reliability, and that personal authenticity has a place even in one of the most traditional institutions in the world.